Turn with me, if you would, to Revelation chapter 12. We're just going to continue on in Revelation. But as I began thinking about this with regard to prophecy, one of the things that we see is that God is always faithful to keep His promises. I think that is the biggest thing that we can get from prophecy. Notice here, Revelation chapter 12, we'll finish up with the last several verses here, beginning with verse number 13. It says, "And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." And as I was thinking about this, I was listening to a preacher yesterday, and he has some different prophetic views. He's actually a post-millennialist. And I don't understand at all how a person can have some of these views that are out there. But when we think of some of these false views of prophecy, like post-millennialism or even the post-trib rapture or the historicist view of prophecy, where they would view the book of Revelation as being kind of the scheme of church history over the 2,000 years, I think some of the motivation behind that is to attempt to make prophecy relevant for the church. When we look at the Old Testament, it's easy for us to understand the relevance. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, Paul says that the things of the Old Testament, they were written for an ensample, and we receive admonition from them. So they are written for us to learn. You know, we look at the Old Testament, and if we want to know, well, for instance, one of the things that comes to my mind right away is this idea of fornication. How do we know what fornication is? How do we understand God's view of sexual immorality? Well, we can go back to the Old Testament, because if all we had was just what the New Testament teaches on fornication, we know that God's against it. But as far as specifically what all makes up this idea of fornication, well, we can go to the Old Testament and we can see various things that God says is sexual sin. We can see that. One of the things else that we see in the Old Testament is we see God makes promises, God makes covenants, and He keeps all those promises and covenants. For instance, in Hebrews chapter 11, we are encouraged by 16 specific people of faith from the Old Testament. And we're strengthened by the fact that we can look back and we can see through their lives how God made promises to them, and He has kept His promises that He made. And we're encouraged and strengthened from that. We see God is faithful. God is always faithful to follow through with what He says He will do. God made promises. We see how He has kept those promises. And so we know that today we can trust God because we have a track record of His faithfulness through the Old Testament. As we study prophecy, this is where it gets kind of difficult sometimes. I think the temptation is to try to put the church everywhere in prophecy. But we don't have to do that. We don't have to put the church in the midst of every prophetic passage in order to make relevance to it. As we study the future events, one of the things that we see is that God is so sovereign, God is in so much control over every single created thing, that He can actually tell us in advance how this entire thing is going to play out. His character is unchanging. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He will always be the same. He always will have the same type of character. He is powerful. He has a certain character, and we can rest confident that He is going to complete all of His promises, including those that He's made to us. From the beginning, it's been Satan's plan and objective to destroy God's people. We talked about that some over the last couple of weeks, beginning with Adam and Eve, and then going all the way through. Satan has been attempting to prevent the coming of the head-crushing seed, Jesus Christ, the promise that he made to Eve. We see this battle first beginning with Cain and Abel, and we see it extending all the way through history, all the way to the times of the Romans, and even in the midst of the Jewish leaders in their attempt to get rid of Jesus Christ. After Satan's failed attempt at the cross to destroy Jesus, realizing that he has played right into the hands of God, he has frantically tried to eliminate the church and Israel since that time. And all of it has been an attempt to thwart God's plan and to, in some way, try to keep Jesus Christ from coming back. If he can get rid of Israel, if he can get rid of the church, well, then there's really no reason for Jesus to come back. Then maybe God will just stay in heaven, and then he can just kind of have the earth and kind of run it as he wants to. But into this satanic persecution that has been going on over the thousands of years, God has always injected divine intervention. Though at times in the church's history, her numbers have been very, very few because of persecution, Christ has been faithful to his promise that the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. God is always faithful to his promises. In Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 9, God says, "Know therefore that the Lord thy God, he is God, the faithful God, which keepeth covenant and mercy." In Psalm 89 verse 3, God says, "I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn unto David my servant, thy seed will I establish forever, and build up thy throne to all generations." In verse 28, he says, "My mercy will I keep for him forevermore, and my covenant shall stand fast with him." In verse 34, "My covenant will I not break nor alter, the thing that is gone out of my lips." So God is always faithful. We see it in the past history with Israel, in spite of all the difficulties and hardships that have come upon them, the only reason Israel still exists today is because God made a promise to keep Israel. He says in Jeremiah chapter 31, "Thus saith the Lord God, which giveth the sun for light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar, the Lord of hosts is his name. If those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel also shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus saith the Lord, if heaven above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth stretched out beneath, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all that they have done, saith the Lord." So as long as there's a sun, moon, and stars, God is going to keep his promise. And though Satan has always come against God's people, we see that God has only allowed things that will bring him the most glory. Somehow, God has worked it out that the only things he allows to happen are those things which will result in his ultimate plan. Psalm 76 verse 10, "Surely the wrath of man shall praise thee, the remainder of wrath wilt thou restrain." And as we think about God's faithfulness, nowhere is God's faithfulness and power better demonstrated than in his dealings with Israel. Not only in the past, but the greatest test of God's promise is going to come in the future during the Great Tribulation period. And that's where we're at in our text in Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12 has been describing this war that has been the satanic war that has been coming against Israel and her Messiah. In verses 1 to 5, we see Satan's battle against the messianic line that we looked at a couple weeks ago. Satan's attempt to prevent the seed. Satan's attempt to keep the promised seed from coming. One of the things that we see is that through every single attempt to destroy Israel, the seed still came. Verse number 5, he says, "And she brought forth a man-child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne." Despite the attempts to destroy Christ in his ministry, Satan played right into the hands of God in Jesus dying on the cross, because he rose again. He purchased salvation. That was the determining counsel and foreknowledge of God. And since then, Satan has tried not only to eliminate the church, but he has tried to eliminate Israel. Verse 6 of Revelation chapter 12 then transitions from the time of Christ and his ascension, and then coming all the way forward to the time of the Great Tribulation. It says in verse number 6, "And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days," 3.5 years. In verses 7 to 12, we get a little bit more detail, focusing in on the spiritual battle that has been going on in the heavenlies. But it is a spiritual battle that at the midpoint of the tribulation, it is going to reach its apex. It is going to reach the highest, hottest point. And Satan and all of his demons are going to be cast out of all the heavenly realm and restricted in their activity to this earth, which is going to bring about the abomination of desolation. In Matthew 24, Jesus tells the Jews that are in Judea that when they see the abomination of desolation, they are to flee into the mountains. And in our text, we find Israel fleeing into the wilderness, which the wilderness referring to the area east of the Jordan River. Is a mountainous region. Daniel chapter 11, I think it's verse 41, he talks about it, that it's Edom, Moab, and the chief of the princes of Ammon. It's in this area where Petra is. It's also referred to as Selah in Isaiah. But not only will the world experience God's wrath during this period of time, notice in verse number 12, it says, "Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time," a very short time. He's had almost 6,000 years up to this point that he has been wreaking havoc of this planet and on humanity, and now all of his power is concentrated to the earth, and now he's going to, in essence, bring it all out in the last 3.5 years. So not only is the world going to experience God's wrath during these final 3.5 years, they are also going to experience Satan's wrath. And so where we're at in our text now is the aftermath immediately following his being cast out of heaven to the earth. And I want you to notice here in verse number 13, we see the first thing that's going to take place, and that is the persecution of Israel. It says, "When the dragon saw that he was cast into the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child." So now that he's cast down, he's concentrating his focus on the nation of Israel. And really, this is going to spawn probably the greatest movement of anti-Semitism that the world has ever seen. Far worse than the Holocaust. In Matthew chapter 24, in verse number 15, Jesus tells the Jews, "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stay in the holy place, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be." In verse 22 he says, "And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." So we see that during this period of time, it is going to be so bad that Israel will almost be wiped out. And really, this is the tragedy, I think, of the Augustinian Reformed theology, this idea of replacement theology, that the church has replaced Israel. This has been the basis up to this point, really, of the organized genocide of the nation of Israel. The Catholics have tried through the Crusades to wipe out and to destroy Israel. The Crusades, the Holocaust. In fact, it was in the Holocaust that Hitler received a lot of his permission from the governments to do what he was doing and from the churches to do what he was doing because of the words of Luther. He was no friend of the Jewish people. during the Great Tribulation, is going to be the very author of the doctrine of replacement theology, the doctrine of anti-Semitism, that is going to begin to apply this doctrine, and it will be the most devastating attempt. During the Holocaust, 1/3 of the Jews were killed, but according to Zechariah chapter 13 and verse 8, 2/3 of the Jewish people will be wiped out during this time. That's why Jesus doesn't allow it to go past the 1,260 days or the 3.5 years. It's shortened, he says, for the elect's sake, for Israel's sake. But as we saw back in verse number 6, there is a place specifically prepared of God for Israel, and it is this place in the wilderness that Israel is going to flee. There's going to be other believing Jews around the world that will be provided for during this time by Gentile believers. Matthew 25 speaks of that. As much as ye have done unto one of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it so to me. Those are the Jewish people during this period of time. There's going to be a whole bunch of Corrie ten Booms in the world during this time. It's not going to be just one lady trying to do this. There's going to be many during this period of time. And it seems that it will be most likely the unconverted Jews that are going to flee, those whom God is trying to draw, those who have not sold out yet to the Antichrist, that have rejected the mark of the beast. They are the ones that are fleeing from the persecution. In fact, in Hosea chapter 2, beginning with verse number 14, God says, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak comfortably unto her. And I will give her vineyards from thence, and the valley of Achor for a door of hope, and she shall sing there. And in the days, as in the days of her youth, and as the day when she came up out of the land of Egypt. And it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, that thou shalt call me Ishi, which means my husband, and shalt no more call me Baali, which means Lord. I will take away the names of Balaam out of her mouth, and they shall no more be remembered by their name. And in that day will I make a covenant with them, covenant for them with the beasts of the field, and with the fowls of heaven, and with the creeping things of the ground. And I will break the bow and the sword and the battle out of the earth, and will make them to lie down safely." And then he says in verse 23, "And I will sow her unto me in the earth, and I will have mercy upon her that had not obtained mercy. And I will say to them which are not my people, Thou art my people, and they shall say, Thou art my God." So there in Hosea he says, I am going to take Israel into the wilderness for a very specific purpose, and that is to allure her to me, to draw Israel back, and that is what God is going to do during that time. And one of the ways that he's going to do this is he is going to miraculously provide for them. Notice in verse number 14, he says, "And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent." So this is her place. This is a place that God has specifically prepared, and it says that he gives her 2 wings to flee there. Now, some people have taken this, 2 wings of a great eagle, and they say, well, that's the United States, and so the United States is going to help them to flee or whatever. And you know, maybe. And I don't think it's referring to aircrafts. God uses this analogy, this imagery of eagle's wings in the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, in reference to bringing them out of Egypt and providing for them in the wilderness, God says, "Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself." He uses the same imagery in Deuteronomy chapter 32, where he describes how an eagle will take her young and will actually disrupt the nest to kind of basically thrust them out of the nest, and then the mother eagle will then fly underneath them to see to it that the children don't fall to their harm. And so God uses that and says, I thrust you out of Egypt, but then I bore you on eagle's wings to provide for you. And that is exactly what God did for Israel. He carried them along. He ensured their well-being. He provided for them in the wilderness. And this is exactly what he's going to do during the tribulation period. And he has to. Remember in Matthew 24, he says, when you see the abomination, he says, if you're on the housetop, don't even go into your house. You get out of town. You just flee to the wilderness. If you're in the fields working, don't come back to take anything out of your home. Just go. Run as fast as you can. So these people, when they leave, the only thing that they have is the shoes on their feet, the clothes on their back, and their money is absolutely worthless if they have any in their pocket, because the mark of the beast is coming into effect at the same time. So they can't buy anything. God has to provide for them. There's no food, there's no water, they're going into a desolate wilderness. And in verse 14 it says that she will be nourished for those 3.5 years. It means that he's going to feed them. It means he is going to provide the food. It's the same word that's used in the Greek in verse number 6, to feed her. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, God speaks of this with Israel during those 40 years. Who led thee through the great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water? Who brought thee forth water out of the rock, a flint? Who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee to do thee good at thy latter end? In chapter 29 of Deuteronomy, he speaks of how their clothes wax not old, and their shoes wax not old on their feet. In Nehemiah chapter 9, he speaks of how they lacked nothing. Their clothes waxed not old, and their feet swelled not. This is exactly how God is going to provide for Israel during this period of time. I think as Israel is there in the wilderness, God is going to provide manna in some way. He is miraculously going to provide food for them. He is miraculously going to provide water for them. Their clothes are not going to wear out. And this isn't 40 years that we're talking about here. This is 3.5 years. So this is almost a smaller miracle than it was in the time of the Exodus. But nonetheless, God is still going to provide. And not only is he going to provide their food, he is going to miraculously protect them as well. Notice in verse number 15. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. So this is going to be the hottest persecution against Israel. This idea of the water coming out of his mouth is not talking about literal water. It says as a flood or like a flood. This is symbolism that he's using here. And God uses the same symbolism throughout the Old Testament. In Psalm 69, David says, I sink in deep mire where there is no standing. I am come into deep waters where the floods overflow me. And then he likens that in verse number 4 to his enemies. They that hate me without a cause are more than the hairs of mine head. They that would destroy me, being mine enemies, wrongfully are mighty. Then I restored that which I took not away. So David says, the floods were against me, and what he's referring to is the enemies that he has. In Isaiah chapter 8, verse 7, it's used of the king of Assyria. In Isaiah 59, we're familiar with this verse, when the enemy comes in like a flood, then the Spirit of the Lord will raise up a standard against him. So this is what's going on here. As Israel begins to flee into the wilderness, what Satan is going to do through the Antichrist is he is going to begin to send out his armies after them. He's going to send out his armies like a flood against them. But what we see here in verse number 16, it says, the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood. So these armies are going to be swallowed of the earth, just like in Numbers chapter 16 with Korah. The earth opens up, the earth swallows them, and they're brought down to hell. That's exactly what's going to happen to the armies of the Antichrist during this period of time. Now, this is not a final defeat of Satan. In fact, this is actually going to turn up his wrath against humanity. Though he has failed to destroy these Jews that are fleeing into the wilderness, in his prideful deception, he is still going to believe that he has another opportunity. Now he's going to turn his focus onto every single believer at this period of time. In fact, we see that even in Revelation chapter 13, if you just look over there, verse number 5 says, talking about the Antichrist, there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 40 and 2 months. And he opened his mouth and blasphemed against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him, notice, to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. I think this also is one way to know that the church is not in this period of time. Because the church, Jesus said, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And here we have the Antichrist overcoming. He has the authority to overcome these people. Now notice here in verse number 17 of Revelation 12, it says, the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war, notice this, with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Now who is the remnant of her seed? This is not Israel that he's going after. Israel brought forth the seed, which was Jesus Christ. He is the seed, verse number 5. He's the man-child. So this is not the remnant of the woman, this is the remnant of her seed. So this is the remnant of Jesus Christ that is here. This is the true believers of Jesus during this time. Now how do we know that they are true believers? Well, they keep the commandments of God and they have the testimony of Jesus Christ. It doesn't get any clearer than that. That is a description in every age of those that follow Christ. No doubt there will be an attempt to destroy the 144,000, which will be a failed attempt because they are sealed and protected. But he'll have a good deal of success against this remnant. These are the people spoken of in chapter 7. John sees this innumerable multitude that are clothed in white linen, and they have palms in their hands, and he's asked, who are these which are arrayed in fine linen? And he says, Sir, thou knowest. And the angel responds to him, These are they that come out of great tribulation. This is the period of time that they come out of. They come out of this period of time because Satan, through the Antichrist, is going after them in his great wrath. While they will not be divinely protected during this period of time, we do know that they will be provided for. In Matthew 24, let's just turn over there real quick in Matthew 25, and this will be our last passage. I'm closing up here. But in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus is describing that period of time when he comes. He's finishing up the Olivet Discourse down to verse number 31. And he is describing when he sits on his throne and all the nations are going to be gathered before him. Verse 31 says, When the Son of Man shall come in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations. And he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then shall the king say unto them on his right hand. Now, who are these that are on his right hand? These are believers. These are those out of the nations who are believing. These are Gentile believers during this period of time. He says, He'll say to them on the right hand, Come ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Now notice, verse 35, For I was an hungered, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and ye took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came unto me. Then shall the righteous answer him, saying, Lord, when saw we thee and hungered, and fed thee, or thirsty, and gave thee drink? When saw we thee a stranger, and took thee in, or naked, and clothed thee? Or when saw we thee sick, or in prison, and came unto thee? And the king shall answer and say unto them, Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. So, even during this period of time, they will be provided for. So we see that even during the harshest, the most difficult times of human history, God is going to take care of His people. He is going to provide for them. Is God faithful? Absolutely. God is always faithful. If He's been faithful in the past to provide, He will be faithful in the future to provide. And if He has been faithful in the past and He will be in the future, we know that He will be faithful even now to us to provide. So in the best of times, in the worst of times, we can always trust His faithfulness. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5 and 6. For he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. Let's pray. Father,